Ah yes, Capcom, the legendary company behind many different fighting games. The Street Fighter games, rival schools, Darkstalkers, and more, all came from this famous entity. However, as great as many of these titles are, they have not always gotten it right. In today's upload, we are going to be covering one of their most infamous missteps, and looking at a video game that was so lackluster, it would pretty much result in 2D Capcom fighting games being put to pasture. What is it about this game that has led to it to receive such a poor reputation, and how come hardly anybody ever plays this one? Let's try and answer all of these questions in this video now. So with all of that said, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of Capcom Fighting Evolution and why it failed. Yeah. Capcom fighting games are undoubtedly amazing, but even the most die-hard fans would have to admit that there was certainly a period in time where there were more of these being published than what was possible to keep up with for most. Some of the most exciting of these were the Marvel vs. Capcom crossover games, which at the time were rounded off with the giant, impressively chaotic Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Not only that, but we would also get crossover titles that were made featuring SNK fighters, a dream series of titles that fans of the genre could not believe had become a reality. Like Marvel vs. Capcom, the Capcom vs. SNK games were fantastic, with Capcom's most rounded effort climaxing with Capcom vs. SNK 2. In the realm of 2D Capcom fighting games, it felt like we had seen it all, as the company had pushed the quality of the crossover formula to its apex, leaving us all to wonder what Capcom could possibly come up with next. Such a question would finally be answered in October 2004, with the Japanese arcade release of Capcom Fighting Evolution. The game was developed to take advantage of the Namco System 246 board. This board was created to mirror the Sony PlayStation 2 in the same way the Sega Dreamcast and Sega Naomi complemented one another. This made it very easy to release the game in both the arcades and on the PS2, with an original Xbox version being created in tandem. Known as Capcom Fighting Evolution in North America and Capcom Fighting Jam around the rest of the world, what better way to begin analysing this game than by checking out its arcade attack sequence? So without further ado, let's take a look. The vibrant, upbeat introduction, although not featuring any fighting, instantly gives us a strong indication as to what this game is all about. Basically, you had heard of Marvel vs. Capcom and Capcom vs. SNK. Well, this one is basically Capcom vs. Capcom. The fact that the company made so many fighting games meant that Capcom had a ginormous roster of fighters to pick from and include in such a title, with room to include potentially more than ever before. Especially when we consider that roster spots would not be taken up by Marvel or SNK fighters this time around. Unsurprisingly, even though there are many fighting games in Capcom's portfolio, when it comes to Capcom Fighting Evolution, as usual the company would rely on their biggest cash cow to carry this new franchise: bloody Street Fighter. This means that Street Fighter characters take up the majority of roster spots within the game, taking priority above those from other series. Sadly, despite having a huge pool of fighters to choose from, Capcom instead opted to have a reasonably small roster for this one. The game's 21 characters are split into different groups based on their respective franchises. So let's briefly go through the game's representatives and discuss where each of them are from. Obviously, a Capcom crossover game wouldn't be a crossover game without fighters from Street Fighter 2, with this game being no exception. We have 4 popular characters from Street Fighter 2 appearing in this one, all of which have appeared in previous Capcom crossovers, and rightfully so, as these are some of the most recognisable characters in all of gaming history. Further to this, we also have Darkstalkers characters included too. Speaking of which, most of them had appeared across previous crossover fighting games. However, this would be Jeddah's first appearance outside of the Darkstalkers universe, originally debuting in Darkstalkers 3. In a rather nice surprise, we would also receive a selection of characters from the game Red Earth, which, in my opinion, is the most pleasant addition to this fighting game, especially considering how little love Red Earth generally gets. Of the 4 characters representing Red Earth, we have the Thundercat-like Conan the Barbarian-esque hybrid, known as Leo, the Japanese ninja warrior known as Kenji, and even more surprisingly, 2 of Red Earth's previously uncontrollable boss characters, who are also playable. These include Hauzer, the huge T-Rex beast from the original game, and Hydron, the mischievous half Nautilus and half Kraken monster. This marks both the first and last time either of these characters have been playable in any Capcom title. Moving on, we have a selection of 4 fighters from Street Fighter 3, which is a tad disappointing in a way, as Chun-Li is one of this group's representatives. Sure, she was a part of Third Strike, and was one of the most selected fighters, but she is certainly more heavily associated with Street Fighter 2 than any other game. At least we would get Alex, Yun and Urien though, all representatives who debuted in Street Fighter 3 games. None of these characters are included in Capcom's previous fighting crossover games either, so this marked the character's first ever appearance outside of the Street Fighter 3 franchise. Finally, the game offers representatives from Street Fighter Alpha. As expected, we would have Sakura representing the Alpha lot, which is no surprise when we consider how much Japan seems to love her. The character, inspired by Sailor Moon and other heroes of this Japanese archetype, had already appeared in both Marvel and SNK Versus games, along with rival schools too, so she was a veteran of crossover fighters by this point. Rose and Karen would also be playable in a crossover for the first time, and lastly we could play as Guile. His inclusion though is slightly frustrating, as it just makes you wonder what could have been. Rather than including 3 different Street Fighter teams, they could have instead made one a Final Fight one, and that's without even mentioning the possibility of a rival schools team. At least we got one completely new character for the game though, Ingrid, which brings us on to a whole nother section of this video. While this was Ingrid's debut, she actually originates from an unreleased 3D fighting game known as Capcom Fighting All-Stars. This game that was never to be was sadly cancelled in August 2003, which raises the question, why? Well, it is said that Capcom had beta tested the game, but after receiving negative feedback from players and spending more months in development, the game would be scrapped altogether. Rather interestingly though, its cancellation would result in many elements of its gameplay being reused for the production of Capcom Fighting Evolution, with Ingrid for example being resurrected from the failed game's project. As for Fighting Evolution, players must choose 2 characters on this game's character select screen. This is due to, you guessed it, tag team matches players, because what would a Capcom crossover fighting game be without a Teddy Long reference? Bitches love tag team matches. Mechanically, it is very different though from say Marvel vs Capcom. In Capcom Fighting Evolution, you can only control 1 character per round rather than actually tagging in and tagging out. Players select a pair of characters, then begin a match with one of those characters. If you win a round, you can carry on playing as your first pick. If you lose, you pick up control of your second fighter. So really I guess it's more 2-on-2 rather than say tag, which must have been disappointing for old Teddy. Sadly, as you can see, this does not offer the same chaotic amusement that the Marvel vs Capcom games provided, but in fairness to the developers, the game was never intended to do so in the first place. The unique feature of this title was that it was intended to be about balancing different fighting game mechanics under one roof, then pitting the different styles against one another. Characters from 3 different Street Fighter games may mean that this one lacks fighting game universe diversity, but we do get mechanics mixed up from 3 different Street Fighter games. Prior to this, for a long time, mixing different styles posed some interesting questions among fighting game enthusiasts. Many people had their preferred fighting game and one particular title they excelled at. A player could be great at Street Fighter Alpha, but less competent competitively at Street Fighter 3 for example. Therefore, it was always debatable who truly was the best. In some ways, Capcom Fighting Evolution existed to answer the age-old question of who would win in a fight when discussing fantasy scenarios, such as who would win in a matchup between Muhammad Ali and Jackie Chan, or 100 Billion Lions and the Sun. Capcom Fighting Evolution was designed to be a game where the mechanics from 5 different Capcom fighters would be included, but balanced out and tuned to make things as competitive as possible. A pretty bold and interesting feat, but was such a concept successfully executable? Well, history now shows us, in the case of this game at least, that although Capcom did this, they didn't do it very well. Within this game, where you can pick different characters representing different franchises against one another, each selection of fighters functions differently from the next. Street Fighter 2 characters come with basic combo abilities and super bars. They can perform super combos and execute air blocks, and their fighting style is mechanically most similar to Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. As for the Street Fighter Alpha characters, they differ in that they can perform both super combos and custom combos. They can also perform air blocks and also safe falls where they can perform rolls. Further to this, they can execute alpha counters, used at the cost of the character's super meter. Simple counter attacks can also be performed while blocking. Regarding Street Fighter 3, 2 meter gauges are present for these characters, so the game's fighters can use their traditional super arts and EX moves. These fighters can also dash forward and backwards, and the famous parrying system is present. The quick stand and super technique can also be performed when playing as these combatants. As for the non-Street Fighter characters, the Darkstalkers and Red Earth representatives have received power boosts in this game, because characters from both franchises have fewer techniques up their sleeve than in more complex developed Street Fighter games. In addition to this, Darkstalker characters can airblock, dash, guard cancel and perform boosted special moves and chain combos. Finally, the powered up Red Earth roster members feature abilities inherited from their game. In the original RPG, elements were present, meaning characters could level up and perform stronger attacks by stocking up on gems. Such a feature is present here too, along with the ability to use techniques known as ultimate guards and ultimate counters. Ultimately, this is the reason we never got, say, a Final Fight team, as Final Fight isn't a fighting game franchise where mechanics could be carried over. Well, unless we include Final Fight Revenge of course, but the less said about that, the better. Looking at the different fighting styles included, it quickly becomes clearer why these were the 5 games Capcom chose to try and smash together. While seeing characters from polygonal fighters such as Star Gladiator and rival schools would have been lovely, or say wrestlers from Saturday Night Slam Masters, doing so would have meant a lot more work for those who already worked on this rather challenging project. It would be tough to disagree that conceptually, creating a game featuring all these different mechanics is a tall task, which we will touch more on shortly, but first let's talk about this one's graphics. While marrying up the mechanics of multiple games seems like something that would require a lot of effort to pull off, it appears that Capcom made little to no effort regarding the game's sprite work. From what I can see at least, it looks like every fighter, with of course the exception of Ingrid, that Capcom took them straight from other fighting games, making the overall design of this one not look very uniform and instead look like a copy and pasted, very cheap and tacky looking mess. In some ways, this lack of care and attention to detail makes the game look like a mad bootleg or cobbled together fan project, rather than an officially published legitimate game. Many of these characters are not just from different games, but were created to take advantage of completely different hardware too. For example, you will notice that the Street Fighter 3 characters have much more detail and animation than the Street Fighter Alpha characters, so it looks incredibly odd to see them all feature in the same game. It's very lazy indeed. Backgrounds are dull and unimaginative and do not feature the same amount of detail and attention that many other Capcom fighters have received. It all looks very uninspiring to say the least. In addition to the game's small roster of 21 fighters, fortunately we at least got 2 boss characters as well. These are Akuma of Street Fighter fame and Pyron from Darkstalkers. So again, characters and sprites that have been taken directly from much older games. Sadly, there is no Red Earth secret boss fight, which is a crying shame considering the original title was just a huge boss rush anyway. But not surprising when you consider the complete lack of attention to detail with many elements within this game. Graphically, Capcom didn't give us anything impressive to look at, and it's crazy to think really that they used so much sprite work from games that were 10 years old at the point of Evolution's release. As for this one's general reception, IGN would be amongst the publications that would give the game attention, with them concluding, at first it's actually kind of easy to get caught up in what Capcom Fighting Evolution brings to the table. It managed to borrow more than 20 different characters from 5 established franchises, complete with new and remixed theme songs and brand new stages. I noticed some definite advantages for the Street Fighter 2 and Alpha crew, which frequently do more damage, have better combos, and have seemingly faster reaction times. The biggest problem that Evolution faces, however, is that its character selection is thin and bizarrely populated. Capcom Fighting Evolution is a game that's obviously just porting sprites over from older titles that are barely using up any space. This isn't really acceptable. Capcom Fighting Evolution fails in certain presentation aspects too. For those looking for a true evolution of the fighting genre, like the title implies, you're in for a severe disappointment. There is just not much to it that you haven't seen or experienced before. GameSpot would also give the game coverage, stating, "The game is clearly best suited for hardcore fans of Capcom's fighting games who might enjoy exploring some of the nuances here, but probably won't find much reason to keep coming back." There's not that drastic of a difference from one fighting system to the next, but the subtle differences between them do give the game some depth. It helps to some extent that many of the game's fighters have been at least slightly tweaked since you last saw them. Unless you're dying to experience all the strange matchups possible here, you could just as well go back to playing whichever game all these fighters hailed from. Overall, across various publications, the game was not particularly well received. The mixture of fighting game mechanics impressed, but the number of assets this game recycled, paired with the game's tiny roster, put a lot of reviewers and future consumers off. Reportedly, the game was briefly enjoyed competitively in Japan, but would soon be dropped from major fighting game tournaments. In more recent years, the game's producer, Yoshinori Ono, has commented on the game's lack of popularity, admitting that the game was essentially just salvaged from the wreckage that was Capcom Fighting All-Stars. He also commented on the crossover mechanics and inclusion of various gameplay systems from different games that led to balancing issues with the title. Adding to problems during development, one of the game's producers was moved to work on another project, right in the middle of this one. So maybe the inconsistency in staff helped lead to the inconsistent feel of this title. Looking back at Fighting Evolution, although the concept behind it was an extremely neat and novel idea, putting fighting game mechanics from one game against a variety of others is very tough to pull off well. It pretty much results in a freak show spectacle like when Floyd Mayweather boxed Logan Paul, for example. It's fun on paper, but terrible to experience in real life. Perhaps even more relevant to this one, who remembers that earlier cash grab fight where Colin McGregor boxed Mayweather? Just like Capcom Fighting Evolution contests, this real-life match had unbalanced mechanics, as McGregor had no chance of winning a boxing match. Mayweather in boxing was obviously going to be OP. Capcom Fighting Evolution suffers from the very same issue. Balancing simply isn't always possible between entirely different styles, so therefore the game failed to deliver on its core concept. Building on its lack of appeal, the small uninspiring roster is also ridiculous, and somehow huge fan favourites would fail to be included. A crossover Street Fighter and Darkstalkers game with neither Ken Masters nor Morrigan is frankly absurd. I think the only way Capcom Fighting Evolution could have worked was to go a completely different route. I think the game should have contained one well-refined system, a defined fighting game mechanical style, with simply a huge roster of fighters existing as amazing fan service. As stated earlier, throwing characters from all the already included franchises together, alongside more Final Fight, Rival Schools, Star Gladiator, Slam Masters and more could have been epic, and that's only when talking about Capcom fighting games. Throw Mega Man and Co in too for good measure, this could have been a fighting game for the ages, if done very differently. Coming off of the back of SNK and Marvel crossover games, people expected something far better. Especially when we consider the game instantly lost appeal due to no crossover company being present this time. Capcom needed to go really hard on celebrating their own history, but simply didn't bother. I guess a case could be made that this one was as lackluster as it was, simply due to Capcom not wanting their hard work to go to waste on Capcom Fighting All-Stars. But what was cobbled together in its place would be one of Capcom's most infinite fighting games ever. This is why Capcom Fighting Evolution failed. So with all that said, ladies and gentlemen, that was the history of Capcom Fighting Evolution. For regular doses of fighting game goodness, be sure to hit that subscribe button now, then check out my video on why Tekken Cross Street Fighter has never seen a release. Yeah, cheerio.